with that, I give you Spenser Reinhardt.
All right, thank you. Can everyone hear me? I know I'm pretty quiet. The microphone may not pick me up the best. So welcome to Securing Your Nagios Server. Hopefully you find this informative. Hopefully it's not too boring, especially being the end of the day. Hopefully I don't put you all to sleep. With that being said, if you do have questions, like you said, raise your hand. I'm open to questions anytime, especially at the end. But if something doesn't look right, if you're wondering why I suggest doing something, just throw up your hand. So who am I? Well, I'm a Nagios employee. I've been here since about 2012, little after the conference last year. I'm an active DEF CON member of our local group and the, I guess, worldwide group. I do speak at our local group probably, every 3 or 4 months at the very least. I haven't been to OWASP in a while, but I am a fairly active OWASP member and try and participate in some of their good open source solutions and things. And I do like to play and create capture the flag games. So if you have any interest in any of that stuff too, definitely find me afterwards. I'd love to talk about any of it. Oh, it didn't turn black. Whatever. So why should you care about this talk? Well, if you're not aware, which I would guess being that most of you are in this talk at the moment, you probably are fairly well aware that, internet-based attacks are only going to increase, and they only have been for a long time. The sophistication of the attacks is also only ever increasing, as more and more governments get into it, as more and more different, to put it some ways, terrorist organizations are getting into it. It's only going to get worse, whether they're looking for credit card data or to take down an energy sector or healthcare or whatever it may be. It's not a good thing. On that same note, whether or not you think you are, whether or not you like it, you probably will be a target at some point. It's a pretty common fact by this point that not everyone documents it, not everyone comes out and says that they've been hacked or attacked or whatever. But it does happen, and it's a lot more common than we'd like to think. And especially in the case of your Nagios servers, whether it's Core, XI, you're running Fusion, or anything else, they hold a whole lot of keys and privileged information about your network. Passwords, SNMP stuff, SSH credentials, you name it, they pretty much have it. So just a brief overview. We're going to go through some Apache modifications, some database alterations. I have tried to keep this pretty agnostic to both Core and XI. Obviously with the database stuff to some extent, unless you're running QL or NDO, it is a little more specified towards XI. But we'll also go over some IPtables stuff and some lockdown things you can do for your OS itself. Oh, and to keep you all entertained a little bit more, there's some nice quotes at the bottom. Some are funny, some are insightful, some are just weird. Yeah, we kind of talked about that. I didn't realize I had a second one. But the main point in this one is not too much of this is very difficult to implement unless you've got something special that I haven't already considered, which hopefully I've gotten most of it out of the way. It's pretty easy to implement the changes in either a Core or an XI system that you've already got set up. And really the biggest thing that I'm looking at from my perspective is what some people call the defender's dilemma. And that's basically, as an attacker, I have to find one hole in your network, your server, whatever it may be. As a defender, you have to try and plug and defend all of the holes to prevent attackers. So the more you can do to just shut them down and stop them, the better you are. So we'll start off with Apache stuff. We'll go into removing Apache and PHP versioning. Nothing too major. Does it really stop anything? No, but maybe it doesn't let them identify that you're still vulnerable to a 0-day that's out there, or an O-day, whatever you want to call them. Some virtual host restrictions, lock things down for your own network. Forcing SSL, and then increasing your SSL certificate and algorithm strengths. And then especially for XI systems, mod security is a big thing that you can integrate. I've made it really easy, and it works pretty well with everything. I have seen some examples that still don't work, but if you do have issues, we can certainly work through them. So, getting rid of versioning information. Like I said, pretty easy. Especially on CentOS and RHEL systems, if you're running core on something else. And I should say all of these slides are specific to CentOS and RHEL, or Oracle Linux. If you're running something else like Ubuntu or Debian or SUSE or whatever, these files may be in a different place. The same changes in most cases should apply. But the server tokens and the server signature will turn off what modules and what versioning your Apache server shows, and in fact it won't show anything. You can see down below, that's just a wget right here of the base URL, and you can see the server just says, hey, yeah, I'm Apache, but you don't know anything else about me. And PHP, kind of the same thing. You're just turning off PHP from exposing that it's really even there. I mean, unless you're going to a .php file, which is kind of tough to turn it off. Restricting virtual hosts. A little bit more difficult. Basically, it requires you to more think of what you want to do. The interesting part with virtual hosts is that you can switch around the allow and deny rules. And so what you can do is, the base way I've got it set up, or the way it starts off, we'll start there, is that by default, it's set to allow and deny, and everything is set to allow. Whether or not that's what you want, if everything in your network is trusted, if you're in an air-gapped network where the only way you can get to it is if you're at that physical Nagios box or another box in that system, all right, you probably don't have too much to worry about with this. But if you've got internet access, especially if your Nagios box for some reason is available over the internet, has a web front end open, I would really suggest locking this down. You can lock it down to, say that your people are only going to be browsing it outside your network on T-Mobile networks. Okay, find their IP blocks and make virtual host rules that allow and deny based on that. Obviously, by default, you can probably block all of China or wherever else that may want information from here. Going back to the rules a little bit, what I tend to do is set things on a deny allow list, and this way you can start with denying everything. And the way virtual host rules work, or these rules work, is that whatever the last rule that they match, as long as it's not whatever the last rule is, as long as it's not a deny all, will allow or will apply to that host. So if you've got, in this case, deny from all, and then we're letting localhost, a 192 and a 10 dot set of networks through, they'll fully let you go through without any issues because they're the last rules set. Now you can flip this around and have it allow from all and deny from those hosts, and then in that case, everyone but those hosts that are shown on the screen would be allowed. So again, just some things to consider depending on how you set stuff up in your network, how your network is. Maybe you want all of your admin team to be disallowed from accessing it, but a few people. Then you definitely want to set some specific deny and allow rules in differing orders, probably from what I show. So SSL redirection. Whether or not this is necessary is, again, in your individual context and choice, just as most of this is. But in keeping your information away from other people, especially login credentials or as you're doing configurations on your Nagios systems, you're putting a lot of stuff through the wire. Pretty simple rule. You create the https.conf file in your conf.t directory. Add those 3 lines. And fair warning, I wouldn't suggest copy and pasting from my slides when they go up. OpenOffice, LibreOffice tend to change some characters and will break some stuff, especially double hyphens. So I'll put out a document that'll clear that up later. Anyways, what this does is it forces all pages that would be HTTP to redirect to SSL. This means that you don't have to close port 80. If someone comes in on port 80 and tries to just access HTTP, it's going to force you straight to an HTTPS connection. You're not going to be allowed to log in, authenticate anything. Your initial connection and any cookies or tokens and such will be passed unencrypted, but immediately you'll be sent back to an encrypted page. So at least there's that. Later on, we do kind of go through stopping even that issue. So like I said at the bottom, your pages still can be loaded insecurely, but at this point, you can't prevent that. So going on to increasing your SSL security. This is some stuff that myself and one of our other techs went through for a PCI compliance customer in particular that had some issues with the base SSL certificate that OpenSSL and Apache generate. And so apparently PCI compliance doesn't care if you have 2048 or 4096-bit. I think the standard for most internet certs today is 4096 or higher. But either way, you can generate keys just like this with the OpenSSL gen RSA command. You don't have to use AES 256 if you don't want. It is, I believe, the strongest at this point that OpenSSL supports. And then towards the bottom, the additional commands there are just copy. Well, it uses the initial key that you create as a password for a second key. That key is then used to generate a CSR file, and that CSR is used to generate your actual certificate that is signed by the initial key. And the reason I use a password there instead of, or a key instead of a password, is because it's infinitely more difficult, well not infinitely, but significantly more difficult to crack a 4096-bit key to crack your main key than actually break someone typing in password. So then you just copy it into your certs directory in etc/pki tls, and away you go for the most part. You do have to do a couple more things here, mainly just in the base, or well, not in base, but in each of your configs for your virtual hosts. By default, if you follow our SSL guide for XI, and it does apply to Core as well, you will get a virtual host configuration that looks like this and specifically allows and sets 443 directives for that virtual host. It'll turn on things like SSL engine and the SSL protocol. It does not set specifically the cipher suite, the certificate, well, it does set the certificate file. And specifically the big two here are that the SSL protocol all makes it so that it works with everything except SSL v2. So you're forced into SSL v3. If you do an OpenSSL check on that against the website, you will find that you cannot even connect on SSL v2. Your browser has to support it, which everything through IE8 and Firefox 12 work just fine with it. The cipher suite and all of the remote agents, if you're thinking about that, all of the NRDS or anything works just fine. They shouldn't have any issues as far as we've tested. The cipher suite portion there does a similar thing in that all of the exclamation points that are a little hard to read right before each of the different ciphers that are available also lock down this to only allowing 256 or AES 256 and then SHA. And if those aren't available in your browser, it does allow whatever high security is considered by Apache and the browsers. So mod security, this is something I worked on. I don't recall anyone actually wanting it at the time, but I know I've seen some things around for it, And basically, it's just an Apache web application firewall. And what that allows you to do is, before an attack that comes into your system actually touches your backend, or well, I shouldn't say backend, but your actual PHP files gets executed, potentially goes to your MySQL or Postgres or whatever database. This acts as an intermediary and looks at a set of signatures that are continually updated by OWASP and by TrustWave, Spider Labs. And basically, they look for common attacks. They look for common signatures of hyphen hyphen or colon hyphen hyphen or 1 equals 1, something along those lines, that would potentially allow someone to log in or get around other restrictions that may be in place if a particular issue in your code exists that for that particular case would allow SQL injection. Could be cross-site scripting, it could be all sorts of other things. Things specifically that say if there was an issue with the CCM or browsing hosts on or services and the service or host detail pages, where if a particular string was loaded in a host name, it could send your backend API key or your session cookie to an attacker and allow them to become the Nagios admin or whatever your user you're currently logged in as. So ideally, this helps prevent some things like that, kind of clears the air on making sure that they're just not available to be used. Basically what you end up doing is just installing straight from Yum. It's super straightforward. And then I have created a set of excluded rules that need to get copied into the Apache config directory. And that allows you, or mod security, to know, oh, I don't want to run those. Those will not allow the person to, say, submit a new configuration or modify BPI cases, stuff like that. Like I said, I've tried to go through a lot of stuff. This is specifically, as far as I know right now, will only work with XI and Core. If you are going to try and run it on Fusion or Reactor or anything else, let me know what happens. I'm interested. I haven't tested it yet. It is on the plate before probably the end of the year, but they'll be in different configurations for obvious reasons. We'd like to keep everything as locked down as possible on a per product basis. As far as troubleshooting goes, there's a really nasty little one-liner there that will basically pipe out to standard out any mod security rules that you've hit as you're trying to troubleshoot things. So if you go to try and apply configuration, for instance, and you just get a white page, or it just simply doesn't do anything because it may be an AJAX call, you can look in the standard error log of Apache and run, normally you might not pick it out offhand, but if you run this particular one-liner, it'll go through and just output what mod security issues you've hit. And then you can say, okay, well, I need to actually go into that exclusions rule and add it in there as an exclusion that we don't want to have anymore. And then you can go through and try and test your page again. Getting into database alterations, I was looking into this probably a week or two ago, and we use a whole lot of different database accounts. I was actually kind of surprised that there were as many as there were. But in some cases, it does make a lot of sense. Some of the main ones, like changing your root password, pretty basic. You can use MySQL admin. You can log in as root and change it manually like I do in a second for non-root users. But under all of them, I've included the actual links to, or not links, but the actual paths to pages and what you can search for in those particular files for the passwords to change. So you can see you've got, for particularly the root MySQL user, it's mostly just backup stuff that we use it for. It's not touched in many other cases. We don't actually run XI, any commands as the root user. Now, changing for non-root users, which is also an excellent idea, And the reason you might want to do this if you aren't aware, again, if you're getting any sort of issues with your web pages having SQL injection or something like that, they could change which user they're currently logged in as. If there's a known exploit for a plugin that you're running that they can return data to or return a passive check that causes an issue. I don't know of any offhand, but they might be able to then log in as your root MySQL user, dump all your configuration information, and just run away on the rest of your network. So on that same note, along with changing your root user, you can change your other ones pretty easily just by doing the logging in. Oh, that should have been MySQL, not MySQL admin. I'll have to change that. But basically, you log into the main MySQL database, you use the MySQL database, and then you start setting your password, flush privileges, and quit. You can set both the NDO and the Nagios QL users at the same time. You can do them completely individually to make sure that both things are not causing issues in between each other, or that they're both working as you'd expect as you switch them. Totally up to you. There are a fair amount of pages to change when you get to these. For some reason, it looks like a lot of the next two users are hard-coded in some strange places instead of using some of the config files that I would expect. But upon some testing I've done, and I haven't fully tested it, it doesn't seem they ever get overwritten on, in particular, the last three there, and on the next set for Nagios or NDO. The CCM pages, even on a CCM update, so far have not gotten updated or overwritten and have not caused issues. We'll have to see how it works. I am trying to get that resolved so they're not hard-coded in there because it's not really ideal. NDO, a little bit less files to alter, still a couple. Probably the biggest ones aside from your config stuff, or the biggest one aside from your config stuff, is the NDO to DB config for the actual binary itself. You kind of need that to put data in your database. It's one thing if you can't read it. It's another if you aren't actually putting it in. But again, pretty straightforward, just your MySQL users. Postgres, thankfully we only use one, and it's really rather simple to do. You just log in as Postgres and run the alter user and then change the password. Again, there's a few files in there that it's hard-coded for. Nothing different from what the NDO and Nagios QL users have. Aside from that, it's Postgres and not MySQL. And that is all the wonderful database changes you could ever want to make. I was looking into encrypting them without realizing that to do so we'd have to make some pretty heavy changes in the back-end code because you actually do have to do it within your PHP script and not just the database itself. Moving on to our next portion here, IPtables. This is kind of a fun topic because it depends really on what plugins you're using, what things you're monitoring, and whether or not you really care about it. By default, RHEL CentOS systems come with a pretty open base set of rules. They allow anything outbound. They allow SSH, Aide, and 443, if I remember correctly, inbound. It's not super secure, but it's not super unsecure either. For most people that are just running a basic website, you don't really need to alter it too much. If you would like to alter some things, this is a pretty good base template to lock down. The highlighted part in blue is obviously the IP addresses. I just threw in some random ones. Basically, it starts off by flushing your IPtables tables and clearing all of the chains in them. And then it sets everything by default to just drop, or your default condition if nothing else meets it to drop it. We'll start with setting up SSH, your destination port, towards the end. You can see the -A in the beginning there is the chain that you're actually adding the command to or the rule to. The M state and -- state, new established, basically tell it, okay, we do want to consider what state the packet is coming into us from. We only want to accept and allow these packets if they're new, so from a host that we're not currently communicating with, or established. And that's, you know, if we have a current TCP connection, or, well, it wouldn't be UDP because it doesn't bother with establishing connections, then it'll allow those through. And so again, D port specifically is your destination port. You can see you've got a couple 80s, 443s, 5667. As we move down the line, or move along to the IP addresses, you can see some of them change. Reason being, well, maybe you've got one administrator that for some reason won't use, or how do you want to word it? One guy that only needs SSH access, and maybe his system doesn't support SSL. I don't know why that would ever happen, but if he needed only port 80 for some reason, or maybe you've got some redirect there, then that .25 system is only allowed that. 443, your HTTPS connection, you've got .45. You can do subnets, you can set individual objects and things in there as well. IPtables does offer a lot of customization. No, I'm sorry, I'm not going to go into all of that. Going a little further down, there is 5667 to allow remote agents in. Specifically, this one is NRDP, if I remember correctly. And then further down a little bit, 162 is SNMP traps. This would allow, well, that was brilliant of me. That needs to be UDP, not TCP. 162 SNMP traps. Any SNMP is over UDP protocols. It's never TCP, and yes, you can lose information while doing it. I've seen it happen many a time. But this would basically allow your entire 192 subnet to send traps back to you if you have that enabled. So if you've got Cisco switches or Windows servers that do it for various reasons. Along that same lines, you probably want DNS on your system. So we've got 53 there. And going down to the bottom again, the second to bottom line is just allowing anything that's already established. So if you've initiated a connection out to your subnet, well, yeah, it can come back. That's okay. I actually want to receive the results from my checks, thanks. The final line is just allowing IPtables to, or allowing your IPtables to allow your box to send outbound with either TCP or UDP or really any other protocol out there at the moment to your subnet specifically. So OS hardening, fun topics. Address space layout randomization and exec shield are some things that are built into CentOS and Red Hat. Some basic SSH configuration stuff. Aide, which if you've not heard of it, is an open source version of Tripwire. Does a pretty excellent job of monitoring the files on your system. SELinux and GRSecurity, which are some pretty heavy hitters in the permissions restrictions, role-based access controls, and some other fun, really difficult things to work with if you don't do it right. So, ASLR and exec shield, they are very nice anti-exploitation tools that you can enable without any real cost or issues being caused on your system in most cases. There are not too many Linux binaries. Windows tends to like to do their own thing. They do have ASLR, and exec shield would be DEP, or data execution prevention, in Windows. Yeah, we're not going to go into Windows because they're funky. They like to allow their binaries to turn it off. Unix systems seem to be quite a bit more happy with it. I believe GCC by default actually does compile to accept ASLR specifically. And I know for a fact that it works with exec shield by default and stack canaries and things along that line. Basically, ASLR allows, when you're writing an exploit in, probably mid to late 90s at the latest, before ASLR got fully implemented or started to really get implemented, any binaries, including your kernel, would get loaded into static addresses, the same locations every time. They didn't switch it up. They didn't change where anything was in memory unless it was specifically coded in the binary to somehow switch that around. And even then, oftentimes it wasn't moved, or it wasn't truly random at least. What this does is actually randomizes where your stack, where your heap, where executable address space start and stop. And it forces an attacker to go in and use things like return to libc or other pretty advanced exploitation techniques that'll get around actually using addresses and being able to pull in, say, kernel space assembly that's already available or glibc assembly that's already available and actually use that to exploit your system. It's still possible, but it's a heck of a lot more difficult. Exec shield is a similar but different technique. They do work together very well. Exec shield kind of compounds upon the idea of stack canaries, which are as your stack is created or as your program is adding more values to your stack, what it's able to do is every time that there is an instruction pointer pushed to your stack, and depending on your system, it really could be after any variable is pushed to your stack, it will put an 8-byte string or number, because it doesn't have to be a string, in memory before that. And what you can do, or what it allows it to do, is it then, before it will ever return to that string, or return to that instruction pointer with your CPU, it will check that string and verify that it's still the same. If it's not the same, it will actually segfault your system. So your attacker has to get around that, be able to know what that stack canary is before it ever overwrites that section of memory. It really, really helps to stop buffer overflows and things like that. Both of them can be enabled really easily with the sysctl config, and you don't even have to restart your system. Just run sysctl-p to enable them. Testing them out on Nagios, I've been running them for about a month or two on an XI and a core system, and have not had an issue with any of the plugins that I use or the system itself. And I have been playing with Core 4 as well, so it's kind of nice that it actually does work. SSH is kind of a nice thing to lock down as well. Is it as insecure as, well, and is Apache really insecure, or is it the applications behind it that are, is a whole other argument. But there's always different vulnerabilities that can come out, different issues. Just some basic rules that I like to have on my SSH systems, especially, again, if they're allowed access to the internet. You know, max auth retries, max sessions, basic things of just don't allow more than 5 people, don't allow people to retry more than 3 times. Pretty simple stuff. I did not include, you know, validating RSA keys and things like that as well. It's certainly a good idea if you want to include it. And Aide. Aide. This is a fun one. I actually did have a lot of fun setting this up. This is something that I've been meaning to do along with mod security for a long time, in XI specifically. And that's why, if you notice the download link there on the second command, it does specify one of our XI directories. But it should work, especially with a little minimal modification to remove some of the XI specific settings for a core system without any issue. Basically what this allows you to do is I've set up a set of rules upon the base ones that already come with Aide to look at a Nagios system. You take an initial inventory, and once you've got that initial inventory set up, it then continues to run checks against that inventory, basically doing MD5 sums and multiple other sums, checking permissions based on those files, checking their size, when they were last modified, and all sorts of other things. It creates and keeps its own database that only gets altered when you tell it to update that database. So with the rules I've set, it does ignore performance data locations. It does ignore some of the log files or verifies that they're only increasing or decreasing in size. I have created a non-SELinux and an SELinux variation of them both. You'll see in a moment that I haven't had a chance to test SELinux on it for a couple different reasons. But it should be basically the same. There's only one real thing to change to enable SELinux properly for Aide. But the nice thing about this is you can check and, how often do you actually update plugins once you've got them on your system? Probably almost never, unless you're seeing an issue, VMware or something else that updated their host system that you're checking against or their SDK, and now you've got to update your plugins. Well, if an attacker does happen to get in and change one of your plugins to, say, open a reverse shell to them whenever this plugin gets opened, well, now you know much quicker. Ideally, you run this once a day or so, which that's still a long time for an attacker to be in your system, but it's better to know within a day than not at all. And once that it sees that file's newer than it was previously, it's obviously got a different checksum, and potentially permissions are different, Aide will alert you immediately and say, hey, well, there's a major difference here. You need to check out what's going on. The one caveat with Aide is that it does tend to freak out with system updates, Nagios updates, config changes. It's pretty easy to switch back and fix that, or rather update your database so that it does fix it. Just expect it when these things happen. So, as for my friend SELinux, it is a wonderful security enhancement. It is not super easy to work with, especially in the case of Nagios XI. Nagios does have some pretty awesome, Nagios Core does have some pretty awesome guides out there already that do work with SELinux. I've used them. That's what I'm basing my SELinux policies on. It's just not ready for me to put it out to the world yet. I can make it work, but not very well. Adding in additional plugins and things causes all sorts of issues as soon as I do it. Doing Nagios updates just continues to add more issues, so I don't really bother too much. But this is something that I'm hoping to have out either in a near future update or around, at the worst, the 2014 timeframe, as I'm going to guess that we'll have a fair amount of significant changes then as well. So, but in general, SELinux allows you to, again, do some role-based access control, locking down ports, files, different execution permissions for different users, whether Apache can access databases and things like that. If your system were to get attacked while enabling SELinux, it does allow you to lock down what's available to that attacker quite a bit more. For instance, on the last example with Aide, they may be able to execute a plugin, they may be able to read a plugin, but most likely they can't modify it. The Nagios user probably won't have access to that or won't need it. And definitely, or almost definitely, the Apache user wouldn't. So it is a nice thing to have. It's, like I said, just not quite ready. Once I get it out there, I'll put a labs post out or something along those lines. On that same note, something that I'd like to do, but I'm certainly not going to be able to push with a default XI system ever, because it does void your RHEL warranty, or not license agreement, but they call it a warranty, whatever that means. GRSecurity and Pax are a set of similar to SELinux in some senses, and actually it does also specifically allow role-based access control as well, which you would turn off if you enable them both. But more than anything, SELinux does not specifically protect your kernel. GRSecurity and Pax do. They add in a lot of additional security patches for the kernel. They are actually the first people and some of the best implementations for both ASLR and various stack protections. If you've looked into using chroot systems with XI or Nagios Core at all, or even in your own alternative environments that have nothing to do with Nagios, chroot's great, but it's really not as secure as it can be. There's a lot of ways out of it. Pax and GRSecurity do a pretty good job of fixing that up. So that looks like I'm just on time. Is the end of it. Anyone have questions? And thanks for coming. Otherwise.
Well, all right. I knew we'd have a question or two.
I saw that you, while changing the passwords for the MySQL server, you had at least 2 files with the extension dist and saved.
Oh yes, those. I'm honestly not sure why we have those. I didn't get a chance to really ask about them. Every time I remembered it, it was while at home, and I just didn't send an email out about it. I believe that those are from previous updates of like the CCM.
So I'm wondering, do you mitigate it in the Apache configuration to not display these extensions, because the Apache would probably point it as a text file, so the password would be available to anyone?
That's a good question. I'll check on that. I honestly don't know.
Okay.
I had a quick question about, just Nagios itself, other than, hardening the OS stack and all that.
Mm-hmm.
Like in the really, really old way of like segregating objects in Nagios is basically to assign different contacts to different objects.
Mm-hmm.
But like say if you have, customer server A and customer server B, if they're in the same host group, they can see each other. So I'm wondering if like maybe in Nagios Core 4, if there's any way that, we can have a better object model of segregating people like that. Or are we just going to have to be forced to like run multiple instances of Nagios on the same server or in different VMs?
That's something that I'm not really privy to information on. It's something I would absolutely love to see. I think that finer-grained security within Core and XI, it has to come from Core first. But within both products and a lot of other products would be an excellent thing to have. But at this point, I don't see it being implemented.
Okay, yeah, just whenever I see like all of these discussions, it's always like Nagios is like this monolithic thing, one company, one lab, one something. But say if you're like a management service provider and you kind of bundle it with your services that you resell to hundreds of customers,
There's not a
and
whole lot
they have to be separate.
Yep. I
And
fully
that's something
understand
that
where you're coming from. And like I said, that's something that from day one of me starting, that's something that I've liked to see changed. I know we've vaguely discussed some things regarding it, but at this point, I think largely due to some extent how long it's been this way and the expectations of a lot of people, that it would be a rather large change. I don't see it happening unless there's a fair amount of community push for it.
Okay.
Which, please, say something. I would love to start writing code to fix that.
Well, I'm surprised if more people hadn't said that before. I mean, because
like
there's all these companies, it's like, oh, I have 10,000 services, but, how many customers do you have? It's like, if you have 10,000 services per customer, and if you have 100 customers, that's different. But if it's all, you're only monitoring yourself, that's okay. But if you want to have like an HTTP check for 50 different people, but you don't want them to see each other because they're in the same host group,
Well, and there are other ways to do it. You can do it with templates and other things like that, but I understand what you're saying and where the host groups come in handy. or service groups in most cases that you kind of put out there. But it wouldn't be a massive undertaking, but I have a feeling it would be a rather large undertaking, and it would lead to a fair amount of bugs to start off with. Not that we wouldn't want to work through them, but even for the people that I have seen comment on it, usually the answer of templating things to do similar or almost identical use cases generally solves their issue. But yeah, I can't really disagree that if you're not a contact for a host and you're looking at a host group that host is in, or a service group that service is in, that you should only see what you're a contact for.
Yeah, and I never knew if that was a bug or if it was just
Nope.
that was how it was designed, you know.
That is at this point how it was designed.
Okay.
Yep.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Regarding your question, wouldn't you just mitigate the access of the customer to a dashboard or something that you could actually like make pretty for the customer, instead of having to access Nagios directly?
Well, we're just using just the one interface. We're only using core. So, I mean, everybody logs into the same server, the same IP, and that's it. It's a flat model, and it's only based on contacts right now. But that's where the whole thing lies, is even different contacts are still able to see each other's servers, and, you know, that's the whole downfall of it.
With some dashboards like Nagios, you could probably make a manual dashboard that only included.
Oh, that's different dashboards would probably be possible. I think it would be easier just to go ahead with the idea of just creating a different virtual Apache server for every customer, and just run a whole another instance of Nagios with their own little sandbox configuration files and all that. I mean, but I don't want to go down that road because it would just introduce all this redundancy, all these same files, all these same checks, and we're just copying and copying, copying. I'd rather have Nagios do that under the hood for me, just with a basic security model, instead of, you know, just creating all these servers. And, you know, if a customer comes, customer goes away, we're adding and deleting all these servers. And, you know, that's a part of our business, but, you know, the redundancy is what kills me.
Are there any more questions? All righty. Spenser Reinhardt, thank you very much.